Hi guys, I'm going to show you now how to make a basic clone composite photograph. We're going to have an image here that has three versions of Hadley. She's the young woman you see on the right with the red sweater coat. And so I have photographed these three situations with Hadley on the right, Hadley on the left, and then Hadley in the foreground. The other model, Caroline, is there really just to give Hadley somebody to look at, and so that we understand where everybody will be standing. Even when Hadley's not in those positions, we know where she would be. These are all photographed with identical exposures in the manual mode, identical white balance. I have further done a basic edit in both the basic adjustment section and my lens corrections and detail adjustments. And once I got the image looking, one of the images looking how I wanted it to, I then shift-clicked to the other ones and then went to sync down at the bottom of the develop panel and synchronized any or all of the things that I want to be the same throughout the images, which would include things like white balance, basic tonal range, sharpening, noise reduction, lens corrections, anything else that I might want to be the same throughout those. I can then hit synchronize. I already did that, so I'm going to hit cancel now. So these images are ready to go, and now I'm going to open them one by one into Photoshop. And I'm going to do this by going to the photo menu, edit in, and I'm going to choose open as smart object. We'll take a second here for Photoshop to be up and ready, and then we should see this pop into that window. Okay, there's the first one. Now I'm going to go back to Lightroom and choose the second image. Same process, photo, edit in, open as smart object. And there we have the second image open. And now I'm going to go to the third image, photo, edit in, open as smart object in Photoshop. And now we'll have three pictures open. Okay. Now we're in Photoshop, and you can see across the top here we have three tabs. First tab is Hadley on the right, second tab is Hadley on the left, and third tab is Hadley sitting on the ground in the foreground. And all three of these are smart objects. To be able to see all three of these at once, it's helpful to arrange your window, which you can do in the window menu of Photoshop, arrange, and I'm going to tile all of these vertically. Okay, there I can see them all at once, and I can go to each one if you want. This might be helpful, and Command minus a couple times so that you can see the whole image. That's Command minus to zoom out. So now we can see each image in its own little window. We're going to start with this image, which is on the far left, which is actually Hadley standing on the right. That's going to be our base layer, our background layer. Sometimes I think it's also helpful just to shoot the whole scene with nobody in there and use that as your base layer. But we're going to just start with this one as the base layer. And then the other images I'm going to drag on top of that. So how I do that is I go to the tab, let's say, of the second image here. I click on that tab, and then I come over to the layers palette, which we'll see right here. We have that smart object layer. I'm going to click and drag that smart object over to the first image, which is the far left. I'm going to hold down the Shift key when I let it go, and by holding down the Shift key when I let it go, that will be perfectly centered on the layer below it. So now we can see on this left-hand side, we have one layer with Hadley on the right, one layer with Hadley on the left. Now I'm going to go to the right-hand frame where we have Hadley seated in the foreground, and I'll do the same thing where I'm going to drag the smart object layer from there over onto the far left image, holding down the Shift key when I let it go so that it will be perfectly centered when I've dropped it. At this point, I can close up the other two frames. I don't need these files anymore, so I'm going to click closed and say don't save, and click this one closed and say don't save. And what I'm left with here, I hit Command 0 to fill the frame. What I'm left with here is an image that has three layers, and let's take a look at them again. The bottom layer is Hadley on the right. I'm going to name that one Hadley right. Then the second layer has Hadley on the left, and I'm going to name that Hadley left. And the third layer on top of those two has Hadley in the foreground, and I'm going to rename that Hadley foreground. Okay. We turn off that top layer and look at just the second layer. Actually, I'll turn that off for a second so we can see there's the background layer, and as I turn on the second layer, the only part of this layer that I want to keep, the only part of this layer that I want to see is this section right here of Hadley standing on the left-hand side. So what I need to do is select this area and add a layer mask. Now you might be tempted to use something like the quick selection tool and select her very precisely, but you don't need to because everything around her is going to be exactly the same. So we don't need to try to do this very precisely. We can actually do it quite loosely and get a better result. To get a very loose selection like that, I like to use the quick mask mode, and that is down here in the lower portion of the toolbar. The first time I use this tool, anytime I use this tool for the first time, I like to double click it once, double click and make sure that I have selected areas turned on. A lot of times by default it will say masked areas. I like to have on selected areas and then click OK. Having done that, I always look back over here and make sure that that tool is still on. It should look darkened in with a light icon. If it's not, you can just click it one more time. From here, I'm going to use the brush tool. I'm going to use black as my foreground color. Up in the options bar, I want the blending mode to be normal, the opacity to be 100%, the flow to be 100%. In this case, we're just doing kind of a full block out selection, so we don't need these things to be nuanced. I'm going to make a slightly larger brush. I don't need that brush to be very hard. I'm going to set the hardness of the brush down to, well, maybe 20% or so. And you'll see that as I paint, even though black is my foreground color, what I see is a red overlay. That overlay will become the selected area, and that's basically the only area that we're going to keep from this picture. And you'll see that I'm painting over Hadley there on the left, a little bit around the outside of her. Not a whole lot on the outside of her, but a little bit. And that's all good. Once I get that painted and she's red, I'm going to go back over to the quick mask mode and I'm going to click it a second time to exit the quick mask mode. And when I've done that, you'll see that that area that I painted has become a selection with marching ants outlining it. At this point, all I need to do is go over to the Layers palette and click on the Add Layer Mask button down here at the bottom. You'll see a little help bubble pop up to tell me what that is. And when I click on that button, it will add a layer mask that reveals only the selected area. And there we go. Okay, so now we see Hadley on the left, Hadley on the right. However, you might notice we also see a little bit of Caroline, the other model, in there. And that's, in a way, helpful so that we can understand how we can further refine this layer mask. While that layer is active, I'm going to click onto a different layer just for a second so you can see. While that layer is active and I click on the mask where I get these white lines around the outside of it, while that mask is active, I can now continue to paint on that mask to show more or reveal more or hide more of that layer. What I want to do is I want to reveal more of the layer where Hadley is on the left side, and therefore I will be hiding, by blocking it, I will be hiding this part of the Hadley right layer where we see a little bit more of Caroline. And how do I reveal more of the Hadley left layer? I go with my paintbrush, I choose white as my foreground color, which I'm doing right down here at the bottom of the Layers palette. Just clicking on that little double arrow will flip-flop those colors. Also, the X key will flip-flop those colors back and forth. So I want white as my foreground color, and now I'm going to paint, remember I'm still active on the mask, I'm going to paint white over this area, and I'm revealing more of the Hadley left layer so that I can't see the layer underneath it anymore. I'm revealing more of the Hadley left layer with that white. Okay, pretty good. Now I'm going to go to the Hadley foreground layer and make that visible. And now we see the entire image. We see the entire layer of Hadley foreground. The only part of this that I want to keep is the seated figure down here at the bottom. So the same process here. I'm going to enter the quick mask mode. I don't have to double click it this time because it's already in selected areas. I'm going to have my paintbrush. I'm going to have black as my foreground color, and I'm going to go in and paint. Remember, we're using black as the foreground color, but what we're going to see is a red overlay. And that red overlay will become the selected area as soon as we exit the quick mask mode, which I do by clicking on that quick mask mode a second time. Exit that quick mask mode, we see a selected area around Hadley in the foreground, and now I'm going to add that layer mask. And there we pretty much have the clone. We pretty much have the image done, except if I want to point out a couple of little issues. And this is also helpful to learn from. If I zoom in a little bit here, there's an area down here at the bottom where the reflection of Hadley Wright's pants and those stripes and the tip of her boot are kind of missing, and we don't see them here in the reflection. The other thing I'm going to point out is that there's a little bit of a light glow around Hadley seated. It's very faint. You'll see it a little bit more prominently in a minute that I'm going to try to fix. The first issue is I need to hide some of Hadley foreground layer so that I can see more of the Hadley Wright layer. So just like we painted white before to reveal more of a layer, this time we're going to paint black to hide some of that layer. So I'm going to switch over to black while that mask is active. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so I can see this really close. I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I'm going to make that a harder brush. I'm going to change the hardness to maybe about 75% or so. And with black, I'm now going to go in and hide some of this seated figure layer. Now, I'm just doing this with a brush. It's going to work fairly well. You could also use a selection tool to select this figure so that you could paint right up to the edge of it, but I don't think that's terribly necessary. I'm going to paint in here, and you'll see that I'm revealing, or I'm hiding more of the seated layer, and therefore I'm able to see more of Hadley standing on the right there. But you'll notice that the exposures are actually slightly different. Even though I tried my best to keep the exposure identical, I matched the developing in Lightroom, I think there was a slight difference in pulse of the overhead fluorescent lights that made one just a little bit lighter than the other. Those are intermittent lights. Sometimes you get a slight difference in exposure even if you try to make everything identical. So how do I make those look the same? This is where having your image as a smart object is so helpful. So I'm now going to change the exposure of the Hadley seated level and make it just a little bit darker to match, hopefully, the other two layers. And I'm going to do that by going to my layer there, the Hadley foreground layer, and find that little icon that indicates it's a smart object, and I'm going to double click it. I'm going to zoom back out before I do that. Double click that, and this will open it back into Camera Raw, Adobe Camera Raw. I currently have an exposure setting of plus 0.8. I'm going to take that down. Let's try taking it down to maybe plus 65, plus 0.65, and I'll say OK. That will update that layer. You see preparing smart object, and when it's done, they match a little bit closer than before, but not quite enough. So I'll double click that open again, and let's take it down from 0.65 to maybe 0.55 and say OK. And now it's going to update, and pretty good. And a little softer edge brush, and you wouldn't see it at all. I might just get in here and try that a little bit with my paintbrush on that mask. A little bit bigger brush, a little bit softer brush. And I can now get in and soften that edge. Or I could go back into that smart object one more time, maybe drop it to 0.5. But right there, pretty seamless. And now I'm going to hit Command 0 to zoom back out to fill my frame and look at the overall composite, and there we have. If I want to go back to the start, there's my Hadley Wright layer. Here's now my Hadley left layer, and here's my Hadley foreground layer. And there's our composite. Now I would save it and move along.